Okay, guys, this is going to be part two of 8.3. We're going to start with the protest against Vietnam. This is where this will begin. And of course, these protests are going to ramp up tremendously after the Tet Offensive when it becomes evident that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are going to be able to attack the United States and the South Vietnamese Army anywhere, anytime, any place. Most people are going to view the war as being a poor man's fight because most of the people serving in the war aren't necessarily the rich. Medical and college exemptions are going to be issued for the draft. And then we get an event which we saw on the video the other day, which is the Kent State Massacre, where this student protest is going to lead to the Ohio National Guard actually opening fire on student protesters at Kent State in Ohio. And 4 of those students would be killed and 9 of them would be injured. The Vietnam War is slowly losing support, especially after the Tet Offensive. We see people protesting by burning draft cards, burning the American flag. And then even when soldiers come back from Vietnam while the war is going on, they're actually ridiculed and made fun of and not treated very respectfully. The country is going to be divided. We're going to have hawks and doves. The hawks are the ones who are favoring the war. The doves are the ones who are against the war. So we're going to have those two groups emerging. A real popular song during that time is a song that was done by Creedence Clearwater Revival called Fortunate Son. And of course, it is talking about how, the guy that they're talking about in the song is a guy that's not the fortunate son. He's not the one who's rich. He's going to have to end up and going off to fight in this war. So just one of those things from the Vietnam War during that period. So let's look next at Richard Nixon and Vietnam. Nixon is going to run on the campaign that he is going to end the war. He's still not admitting that this war is probably not winnable. And his policy, or how he's going to get the U.S. out of the war, is a policy known as Vietnamization. He's going to slowly begin withdrawing troops, and he's going to continue the bombing campaign. But what he secretly does is that he also is going to launch an invasion and expand the war into Laos and Cambodia. The hopes are that he would slowly stop the flow of weapons and supplies to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. So he begins these secret bombings of Laos and Cambodia, which the Ho Chi Minh Trail actually goes through parts of those countries. And he begins this campaign in 1970. The draft would be forced to an end, but they would go to something known as the lottery system, and they were basically just like you watch a lottery on TV. They were pulling out the little ping pong balls, and if your name was in that color or the ping pong ball that was drawn out, then you were chosen as one of those to go off and fight in the war. The ending of U.S. involvement is going to occur in 1973. The United States, the South Vietnamese government, and the North Vietnamese government would sit down in Paris and sign the Paris Peace Accords. Here's what the details were of that agreement. The United States would withdraw from Vietnam within 60 days. All U.S. POWs would be returned to the United States, and that also the North Vietnamese would not invade South Vietnam. And They're not going to live up to that promise, but that was the promise that was made, that they would not invade South Vietnam, and that the United States would get POWs back and the United States would withdraw. But eventually, the North would invade South Vietnam 10 months after that. And then by 1975, in April of 1975, the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, would fall. Saigon is spelled Saigon. U.S. diplomats, all of the remaining U.S. soldiers and troops would evacuate on helicopters from Saigon, and the North Vietnamese army would move into Saigon, and the war would officially come to an end. This proved that containment is not going to be a positive experience. It's going to fail. The United States is going to lose close to 58,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. Some of the negative legacy of the war is going to be the My Lai massacre, which was a mass murder of 300 to 500 unarmed civilians in South Vietnam by U.S. troops. If you've ever seen the movie Platoon, it's based off of the My Lai massacre. You spell My Lai M-Y, and then the word L-A-I, and then massacre, M-A-S-S-A-C-R-E. The other negative things that came out of it was the use of chemicals on the jungles. Remember in the video that we had watched earlier how they had used Agent Orange, which was a pesticide, and it forced the removal of leaves. It was a defoliant chemical that was used to cause the leaves to fall off of trees and to clear the forest so that the soldiers, the U.S. soldiers and South Vietnamese soldiers, could hunt down the Viet Cong. The other thing that was used was napalm. Napalm is N-A-P-A-L-M. This is a jelly petroleum-like product that could be dropped in bombs or sprayed on things, and it would catch fire. And it was used to also clear the foliage in the jungles, and it was eventually used on buildings and even sometimes later used in flamethrowers on people. Drug addiction came out of this too. A lot of soldiers went over to Vietnam. They got addicted to drugs from dealing with all of the pressure and all of the horror that was going on around them. So drug addiction did come out of this. And probably the final thing, it was the mistreatment of soldiers after they returned from the war. A medical legacy that was left behind was the emergence of post-traumatic stress disorder, which many of the soldiers in Vietnam returned back home with those experiences of war, and they often relived those experiences sometimes in flashbacks and dreams, and it was just not a good thing for those soldiers, but it's often referred to as PTSD. The war left a bad taste in America's mouth as far as that went. Remember, they felt like that the government had lied to the American people. We get something known as the Pentagon Papers. This contains a history of the U.S. role in Indochina from World War II. This leaked to the New York Times, which did not portray the United States in a very good light and what we were doing in that part of the world. Of course, the Watergate scandal with Richard Nixon, the Nixon supporters are going to break into the Watergate Hotel looking for information on the Democratic National Headquarters and looking at seeing what the Democrats were doing. Richard Nixon had authorized that break-in, but he denied involvement. He would later resign because of it instead of facing impeachment. Nixon's leadership caused the American people to distrust many of their leaders during Watergate and even after Watergate. The government really went under the microscope after Watergate. The War Powers Act is the next thing. That occurs in 1973. The main reason we get the War Powers Act, remember, was because of Johnson's escalation of the war remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution where he got authority to send in more troops and send in more military support in South Vietnam. This was sort of a reaction to that, but this limited the president's right to send troops into battle without consulting Congress. And this, again, was the response to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the sending of troops without a declaration of war by Congress. So the War Powers Act addressed those issues. Okay, that's going to do it for 8.3 Part 2. Please make sure that you go over these things. You will see some of these things on your next test, so please make sure that you have written these things down and you are very familiar with them. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask when you get in class. I'll be glad to answer anything from the video. Okay, that's going to do it, and I will see you guys on the next one.